The contact registered on Veyl Oru's board as nothing at all, and that was the first thing that was wrong with it. She had spent 11 cycles as senior scan officer aboard the survey cutter Thren's Mercy, and in that time she had learned the grammar of the deep the way other people learned the faces of their kin. A dead comet spoke one way, a drifting hulk spoke another. A functioning vessel under power sang across 40 bands at once, loud and layered and unmistakable, the way a living thing could never quite hold still. Everything in the dark had a voice. That was the axiom she had built her career on. You could not hide from the instruments. You could only be quiet, and quiet was itself a kind of sound, a hole cut in the noise where a thing had been. But the contact on her board had no voice, and it had no silence either. It sat 11 light seconds off the cutter's bow, holding station in the drift between two nameless stars, and when she tuned the passive array across the full spectrum, it gave her back exactly the same reading as empty space. Not the false empty of a stealthed hull, which showed up as a suspicious smoothness, a place where the background hiss had been sanded too flat. Not the true empty of vacuum, which had its own faint texture, the ceaseless whisper of a universe cooling toward its end. Something in between. Something that read as nothing while her active pingers insisted, coldly, mechanically, that there was a mass out there the size of a small mountain, and that it was shaped. "Say that again," said the captain. Veyl Oru did not turn from her station. Her long neck was bent over the readout, 3 of her 4 eyes fixed on the shifting glyphs, the 4th half-lidded the way it went when she was thinking hard. Behind her, she could feel the bridge crew going still, the particular stillness of people who had heard the change in her breathing. "There is an object," she said, ranged, massed, and confirmed on the active return, roughly 2,000 of spans on the long axis, metallic or something denser, and it is producing no emissions. None. No drive plume, no waste heat, no comm bleed, no navigation transponder, no thermal signature above the background. My passive board reads it as vacuum." "A wreck, then," said the captain. His name was Doral Sath, and he had been in the survey service longer than Veyl Oru had been alive, and he had the particular calm of a man who had learned, the slow, expensive way, that the universe was almost always more boring than fear wanted it to be. Cold hulk. The crew died, the reactor scrammed. It's been drifting long enough to soak down to background. We've logged 9 of them this tour. The other 9 had thermal ghosts, Veyl Oru said. Residual heat in the mass. Decay curves. You can date a hulk by how cold it is, sir. Everything that was ever warm cools slowly. It remembers being warm. She pulled the object's thermal profile up onto the shared display and let the silence say the rest for her. The profile was a flat line, not a decay curve trailing toward the background. A flat line, laid exactly along the background, as though the object had never in its existence held a single degree of warmth. This one doesn't remember. It reads as though it was never alive at all, and a thing 2,000 of spans long does not get built cold. Doral Sath was quiet for a moment. On the display the flat line held, patient and impossible. "Debris field," he asked. "Micrometeorite scarring, give me an age." This was the part Veyl Oru had been dreading, because it was the part that made no sense, and she was a person who had organized her entire life around the premise that things made sense if you looked at them long enough and refused to blink. She keyed the surface return analysis, the fine-grained mapping that read the pitting and the erosion of a hull the way a physician read the scarring of a lung. "That's the thing, Captain," she said. "By the micrometeorite count, it's old, very old. The forward faces have taken enough dust strikes to put it out here, unattended, for something on the order of 100,000 cycles, maybe more. The erosion is deep. It's been drinking the dark for a long time. So it is a wreck. But there's no oxidation gradient, no material fatigue in the load-bearing structure. I'm reading the resonance off the active ping, and the hull rings true, sir. It rings like it came off the fabrication cradle yesterday. And the geometry is intact, perfectly intact." 100,000 cycles in the drift and it hasn't tumbled, hasn't shed a single panel, hasn't been holed by anything big enough to matter. It is old and it is undamaged and it is cold and it is silent, and every one of those things is normal on its own, and all four of them together should not be possible in the same object. She finally turned from her station, all four eyes coming up to find the captain's, and she watched the calm on his broad gray face develop a hairline crack. "Captain," she said, "I have scanned 900s of derelicts in my service. I know what a dead ship looks like. This is not a dead ship. This is a ship pretending to be dead. And it is doing it well enough to fool instruments that have never been fooled before." The Thren's Mercy was not a warship, and every soul aboard her was suddenly, keenly aware of it. She was a survey cutter, 400s of spans from nose to drive bell, crewed by 31 specialists whose weapons training amounted to a single mandatory certification most of them had let lapse. Her hull was thin. Her single-point defense battery was meant for clearing debris out of a jump lane, not for fighting. What she had instead of teeth was eyes, the finest passive and active sensor suite the consortium put into a vessel that size, a floating cathedral of instruments whose entire purpose was to look at the untouched dark and describe it. She was built to answer questions. She was not built to survive the answers. Doral Sath understood this better than anyone on board, and so he did the correct and cowardly and wise thing, which was to order the cutter to hold at 11 light seconds and to touch nothing. "We look," he said. "We do not approach. We do not ping it again above the minimum power we need to hold the return. Oru, drop your active output to the floor. I don't want to be shouting at that thing. We describe it, we log it, we tight beam the whole package back to Relay 7, and we let someone with guns decide what happens next. Is that understood?" It was understood. It was, in fact, a relief, and Veyl Oru felt the bridge exhale around her. The trouble was that describing it turned out to be its own kind of horror. She worked the object for 6 hours, the whole of a watch and part of the next, refusing to hand her station to the relief officer, because she did not trust anyone else to read what the instruments were telling her. She built up the picture the slow, honest way, ping by careful ping, layering the returns into a three-dimensional reconstruction that turned slowly in the center of the bridge like a thing on a spit. It had a shape. That was itself unremarkable. Everything had a shape, but the shape it had was wrong in a way she could not at first name, and it took her most of the first hour to understand why the sight of it made the small hairs along her dorsal ridge stand up. The vessel was long and slender and asymmetric, and it was covered, plated, layered, armored in a way that no consortium ship and none of the 4 other spacefaring species she had ever studied would have built. There was no elegance to it. There was no economy. Where her own people built ships like the bones of birds, hollow and light and beautiful, all their strength hidden in clever geometry, this thing was built like a fist, like a scar. It was too heavy. It carried mass it did not seem to need, thick, redundant plating over the vital spaces, and the pattern of that plating was the pattern of something that had been hit, over and over, by other things trying to kill it, and had decided that the answer was simply to be too stubborn to die. "It's armored," she said aloud, not quite meaning to. "Look at the plating distribution. That's not radiation shielding. The mass is in the wrong places. It's concentrated over the forward third and the ventral center line. It's armored against attack from ahead and below." She heard her own voice thin out. Whoever built this expected to be shot at. They built a survey of the dark, or a colony ship, or whatever this is. It's the wrong shape for a warship. It's too big and too slow, and they still built it expecting the dark to try to kill them. "Or they'd been shot at before," said a quiet voice. It was Nith, the xenolinguist, a slight nervous person who had come up onto the bridge without anyone noticing, and now stood staring at the slow-turning reconstruction with both hands pressed flat against their own chest. "You said the plating pattern looks like something that had been hit over and over. What if it had been? What if that's not a design philosophy? What if that's a history? No one answered Nith, because there was no answer, and after a moment the xenolinguists seemed to feel the weight of what they had said and folded quietly into an empty jump seat at the back of the bridge, still watching. Veyl Oru went back to work. She found the drive first, because the drive was where the truth of any ship lived, and the drive of this one made no sense at all. It sat where a drive should sit, in the aft third, a great clustered mass of toroidal structures ringed in exotic materials her instruments could name but not fully understand. She had expected, when she resolved it, to see the familiar architecture of a fusion torch, or a folded field displacer, or one of the handful of other ways the galaxy's peoples had learned to push mass around. Instead, she saw something she had no name for, and the instruments had no name for, and the reference library that the consortium had spent 40,000 cycles assembling had no name for. Nith, she said, come look at this. Anyone in the library ever seen a drive geometry like this? Nith came and stared, and after a long time said, no. Guess what it does. I don't guess. That's the historian's vice. But the linguist leaned closer, one long finger tracing the toroidal cluster in the air above the display. It's layered, do you see? It isn't one drive, it's three complete and separate propulsion architectures nested. This inner ring is a reaction drive, chemical or plasma, I'd say, for close maneuvering. This middle structure is some kind of field displacer, that's for the long crossings. And this outer lattice, the finger stopped. I don't know what the outer lattice is, but it's the biggest and the newest, and it was clearly added last, retrofitted over the top of the other two, and it's the part that's cold in a way the rest of the ship isn't. Even in the flat line. There's a place, right there, where the flat line goes below the background. Colder than empty space, which is impossible, Veyl Oru said. Yes, I logged it 3 hours ago, and I've been not looking at it because I didn't want it to be real. They both stood there, the scan officer and the linguist, looking at the small region of the reconstruction where the object was colder than the universe that held it, and neither of them said the word that was in the room, which was that a thing colder than its surroundings was a thing that was doing work, that was pumping heat somewhere, that was in some sense still running, 100,000 cycles into its silence, out here where nothing should still be running. It's not a wreck, Veyl Oru said again, softly to herself this time. Something in it is still on. The order came from Relay 7 11 hours later, tight-beamed back across the light towers in the clipped official cadence of the Deep Survey Command, and it was not the order Doral Sath had asked for. He had asked them to send a warship. He had asked them to flag the coordinates, quarantine the volume, and send something with guns and armor and a captain who was paid to make the hard call. He had, in the private log that he thought no one read, asked them to let his cutter turn around and go home. What Relay 7 sent instead was a commendation, a research priority reclassification bumping the object to the highest tier the survey service maintained, and an order to conduct a close approach and, if feasible, to board. They want us to board it, said Doral Sath, and he said it in the flat, dead voice of a man reading his own sentence. 100,000 cycle-old armored ship that is colder than space and reads as nothing, and is somehow still running, and they want 31 unarmed scientists to fly up to it in a survey cutter and knock on the door. There's a rationale, said the first officer, a stolid person named Quenth who had the survey service's institutional loyalty bred into every fiber. The find is unprecedented. If we withdraw and wait for an armed response, best case is 40 cycles before a capital vessel reaches this volume. 40 cycles of drift. The object could tumble out of the ecliptic, could be lost, could wake up, said Nith from the back. Quenth's mouth closed. They're not wrong that it's important, Veyl Oru said, because it was true, and because she had learned long ago that the only way to survive a bad situation was to refuse to lie to yourself about any part of it, including the parts that supported the thing you were afraid of. It's the most important object anyone in the survey service has ever found. If it's what the drive suggests, if that outer lattice is a propulsion method nobody in the galaxy has ever developed, then whoever built this was ahead of us, ahead of everyone, and they're gone and they left this behind and we found it. You don't leave that in the drift and hope. I understand the order. I just don't want to be the one carrying it out. Doral Sath looked at her for a long moment, with all four of his tired old eyes. None of us do, he said. That's the job, all right. We do this carefully and we do this slowly, and the very first hint, that thing does anything other than sit there and be cold, we run, and I don't care what Relay 7 says about my career. Oru, plot me a close approach. Match velocities, hold at 100 spans, and we'll put a survey drone on the hull before we ever risk a body. I want to touch it with something we can afford to lose before we touch it with something we can't. Veyl Oru plotted the approach. It took the cutter 19 hours to cross the 11 light seconds, because Doral Sath crept the whole way, killing his velocity in 100 tiny increments, never once letting the drive plume point at the object as though a 100,000-cycle-old machine might take offense at being shown a weapon. The whole time, Veyl Oru watched the flat line. It did not change. The object took no notice of them. It hung in the dark, cold and silent and shaped, growing in her instruments from a point to a smudge to a thing with edges to, at last, a wall, an immense curving wall of pitted gray-black plating that filled the forward viewports and blotted out the stars, so close now that she could see the individual dust craters pocking its surface, tiny frozen splashes, where 100,000 cycles of the galaxy's slow rain had struck home. And she could see the markings. She had not expected markings. A ship this old, this eroded, she had assumed any surface detail would have been sandblasted away long ago. But there they were, on the flank, huge and deep, cut so deeply into the plating that even 100,000 cycles of dust had not erased them. Symbols, a language. Angular, blocky glyphs arranged in horizontal rows, and beside them a shape she recognized as a pictograph, even though she could not read it, a stylized figure, a creature standing upright on two limbs, one of its upper limbs raised. Nith, she breathed, Nith, get up here, there's writing. The linguist was at her shoulder in an instant, and she felt them go rigid, felt the breath stop in their narrow chest. Bring the drone in, Nith said, and their voice had gone strange and high. Close on the glyphs, I need resolution, I need, oh, look at them, look at how they made them. Do you see the tool marks? These weren't printed or grown, these were cut. Someone cut these by hand or with a hand-guided tool into meters of armor plate. Do you understand what that means? They took the time. On a warship-hulled colony vessel 100,000 cycles old, someone stopped and took a cutting tool and carved words into the hull big enough to read from orbit. You don't do that for function. You do that because you have something to say. You do that when you want to be found. Can you read it? Veyl Oru asked. No, Nith said. Not yet, but I will. Give me the corpus and I will. There's enough here, there's repetition, there's structure, there's that pictograph as a key. The linguist's hands were shaking now, not with fear, Veyl Oru realized, but with something closer to hunger. Do you know how many extinct languages I've reconstructed from 3 broken tablets? This is a wall of text. This is a gift. Someone left us a gift. Or a warning, said Veyl Oru. Nith went quiet. Yes, they admitted. Warnings are gifts too, if you live to read them. The survey drone made contact with the hull at the 14th hour of the approach, and nothing happened, which was somehow worse than if something had. Veyl Oru flew it herself, her 4 hands moving across the control surface with the unconscious fluency of long practice, easing the little machine down through the last spans of vacuum toward the vast pitted wall. She had half expected, she was ashamed of it, but she had half expected that the ship would react. That some ancient defensive system would wake and swat the drone from existence, or that the flat line would spike, or that a light would come on somewhere in that dead gray immensity. She had braced for it. Instead, the drone's contact pads touched the hull with a soundless kiss, and the magnetic clamps engaged, and the object simply accepted the touch the way a corpse accepts a hand. Nothing. No reaction. No change in the flat line. The drone perched on the flank of the impossible ship like an insect on the hide of a sleeping beast, and transmitted back a stream of data that made Veyl Oru's blood run cold. "The clamps are holding," she reported, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Hull composition, I'm running it now. That's not right either. It's an alloy, iron-based, primitive really. Exactly the kind of thing a young species pounds out before they learn the clever materials. Except it's threaded through with something else, at the molecular level. Some kind of lattice reinforcement that I can't identify and that has no business existing in an iron hull. It's as though they started with the crudest possible material and then did something impossibly sophisticated to it. As though a people who should have been building with stone had learned to make it stronger than anything we can forge, without ever giving up the stone." She looked up from her board and found the whole bridge watching her. "That's the pattern, isn't it?" she said slowly. "That's the pattern with all of it, the iron hull with the impossible lattice. The primitive reaction drive nested inside the impossible field drive. The crude cut markings on the sophisticated armor. Everywhere I look on the ship, I see something young pretending to be old, or something old that never stopped being young. I see a species that skipped no steps. That kept everything it ever built. That took the club and the spear and the iron and the fire, and instead of leaving them behind when it grew up, it carried all of it forward and made it deadly." She swallowed. "I don't know what made this, but I know it never threw anything away, and I don't think it ever forgot how to fight. That night, ship's night, the arbitrary dark the cutter kept to remind its crew they were animals who needed rhythm. Veyl Oru did not sleep, and she was not the only one. She found the mess compartment half full at an hour when it should have been empty. The crew of the Thren's Mercy were survey people, specialists, the sort who lived quiet interior lives and did not seek each other out. In 11 cycles, she had rarely seen more than 3 of them share a meal by choice. But the object had done something to them. It had frightened them the way a locked room frightens a child, not with any threat you could name, but with the pure fact of a closed door and the certainty that something was behind it, and frightened people gather. She sat with them and did not speak, and listened to them try to talk themselves out of what they had seen. "It's a coincidence stack," said Peril the geologist, a plain, practical person who read planets for a living and disliked mysteries the way some people disliked heights. "That's all it is. Rare, sure. But rare things happen, that's what rare means. It means sometimes. A hull alloy that resists fatigue. A drive that ran cold. A ship that didn't tumble. Each one's a long shot, but the galaxy is enormous and old, and we've cataloged 900 derelicts on this tour alone. And if you scan enough dead ships eventually, you scan the one that beat all the odds at once. It's not spooky. It's statistics." "Then explain the flat line," said Nith. Peril did not explain the flat line. Nobody could explain the flat line. It sat in the middle of the table like an unwelcome guest, and after a while Peril got up and left, and the ones who remained sat with it. "You want to know what frightens me," said Quint, the first officer, unexpectedly. Veyl Oru looked up. The stolid, loyal creature had never once in her memory volunteered a feeling. "It's not the ship, it's us. It's how much we want to go inside it. I've watched this crew for 3 days. We are terrified of that thing, every one of us. Our instruments are screaming and our sense is screaming, and not one of us has said the word we should have said on the first hour, which is home. We should be halfway back to Relay 7 by now, and instead we're creeping toward it a span at a time, and telling ourselves it's the mission, and it isn't the mission. It's that we can't not look. There's something in us that would rather die knowing than live wondering, and I think—" Quenth stopped and looked at the flat line hanging in the air. "I think whatever built that ship had the same thing in it, and I think that's why it's out here. And I don't know if that thing in us is the best of what we are or the worst, and it frightens me that I can't tell the difference." Nobody answered that either. Veyl Oru went back to her station after that, though her watch was hours away, because Quinth was right and there was no point pretending otherwise. She could not look. She sat at the scan board in the dim of ship's night and ran the object again, band by band, the way a person worries a loose tooth, and she found on the 40th pass a thing she had missed. It was very small. It was buried so deep in the noise that only a scan officer who had run the same object 40 times and memorized its every texture would have caught the change. And the change was that there was no change, in a place where there should have been. The background hiss of the universe was not perfectly smooth. It had a grain, a texture, the fossil radiation of a cosmos cooling toward its end, and that grain was everywhere, in every direction the same. Except in a narrow cone leading away from the object, off into the dark where the grain was subtly, minutely wrong, smoothed. As though something had passed through that region of sky, once, long ago, and left the faintest wake, the way a ship leaves a wake in still water that persists for a moment after the ship is gone. Only this wake had persisted for 100,000 cycles. She traced the cone. It led away from the object, back along a bearing, off toward a region of the sky the survey service had never charted because there was nothing there worth charting, a deep quiet emptiness between the arms, a place where the stars thinned out toward the great outer dark. She stared at the bearing for a long time. She did not yet have any of the archive. She did not yet know a single true thing about the makers or the winnowing or the war. She only knew that something once had come from that empty quarter of the sky and passed this way, and left a wake in the fabric of the dark that 100,000 cycles had not erased, and that the object she had been scanning sat squarely in its path, facing it, armored against attack from ahead. She flagged the bearing and said nothing to anyone, because she had no words for what it made her feel, and because some superstitious part of her, a part she did not know she had until that night, did not want to say aloud in the dark that something had come this way from the outer emptiness, in case the saying of it should call the something back. The captain, when she showed him the bearing at the start of the next watch, went very still. "You're certain?" he said. "No," Veyl Oru said. "I'm not certain of anything on this object, but the wake is real, or the wake is an instrument artifact, and I've checked it against every artifact signature we carry and it matches none of them. Something disturbed the background along that bearing, something big enough or strange enough to smooth the grain of the cosmos itself, and to have it stay smoothed for as long as this object has been drifting, and the object is pointed at it. Whatever this ship was built to watch for, Captain, I think it was watching for something that comes from there." She indicated the empty quarter of the sky. "The armor faces that way, the heavy plating. Forward and below, toward that bearing and toward the galactic underside, the two directions you'd cover if you were expecting something to come up at you out of the deep dark between the arms. This ship isn't randomly oriented. It's been holding a firing solution for 100,000 cycles. It's aimed." Doral Sath stood at the viewport for a long time, looking out past the vast pitted flank of the object toward the thin, cold emptiness beyond. "When I was young," he said at last, and it was so unlike him to speak of himself that Veyl Oru held very still, the way you hold still when a wild thing comes close. "I asked one of my instructors why the deep survey existed at all. We had the trade lanes mapped. We had the good worlds. Why keep pushing the cutters out into the quiet, cycle after cycle, cataloging empty dark that no one would ever settle? And she told me a thing I did not understand for 40 years. She said, because the map is not the territory, Sath, and one day the territory will change. And on that day, the only thing standing between us and whatever changed it will be the ones who kept looking when there was nothing to see." He turned from the viewport. "I think that day may have come, and I think it may have come on my watch, and I find I am not as brave about it as I hoped I would be. Log the bearing, Oru. Encrypt it. If this goes badly, if we do not come home, I want someone to know which way to point the guns." "It won't come to that," Veyl Oru said, "because it was the thing you said." Doral Sath looked at her with all four of his old eyes, and did not agree with her, and did not argue. "Get some rest," he said. "You've been at that board for 3 days. Whatever's inside that thing, it's waited 100,000 cycles. It can wait until you've slept." She did not sleep, but she went and lay in her alcove in the dark, and she thought about the wake in the sky, and the thing that had made it, and the ship that had spent 100,000 cycles holding still and holding aim, patient as a stone, waiting for a thing to come back out of the emptiness between the arms. And she understood dimly, without any of the facts that would later make it certain, that they had not found a wreck or a treasure or even a mystery. They had found a soldier, still at its post, still watching the dark, and they had walked up behind it in the night, and it had not yet decided what they were. The drone found the airlock on the second day. It was Veyl Oru who found it technically, though she gave the credit to the machine, walking it slowly across the hull on its magnetic feet while the whole crew watched the feed. She was looking for a way in, on the captain's order, mapping the surface for any seam or hatch or breach through which they might send instruments or, eventually, bodies. She had found seams. The ship was a quilt of plating, welded and riveted and layered in a way that spoke of long service and much repair, patches over patches, whole sections that had clearly been cut away and replaced with newer metal that had then, in turn, aged. It was less like a single ship than like an idea of a ship that had been rebuilt so many times that nothing of the original remained, a living thing that had replaced every cell in its body and gone on being itself. But the airlock, when she found it, was unmistakable, and the sight of it did something to her that the flat line and the impossible drive and the carved warnings had not quite managed. It frightened her personally in her body, in a way the abstractions had not. Because it was the right size. That was the thing. Every alien architecture had its own scale, the unconscious signature of the bodies that had built it, the consortium built for their long necks and low sprawling frames, the meridians for their bulk, the Scytha for their many small, quick limbs. You could read a species' shape from its doors before you ever saw its face. And the airlock on the flank of the impossible ship was built for a bipedal creature roughly 1.5 spans tall, upright, with grasping upper limbs, a creature that the pictograph had already drawn for her, but that now, in the honest evidence of the door, became suddenly and horribly real. "They were our size," she said, "near enough a little taller. Look at the controls set at the height of the raised limb in the pictograph, the way you'd place a control panel for a standing creature with a reach like ours. And the lock is big, big for the body. There's room in there for one of them and all its equipment and then some. Whoever built this liked to move in armor, liked to carry things. They built the door for a creature that expected to be carrying a lot of gear and to need room to work in it." "Can we open it?" the captain asked. "I don't know if we should," said Veyl Oru. But she tried anyway, because the order stood, and because she admitted this to herself with the ruthless honesty that was the only discipline she truly kept, because she wanted to. Because 11 cycles of scanning dead things had built a hunger in her that no living find had ever fed, and this was the largest, strangest, most impossible thing anyone in the survey service had ever touched, and some part of her that was not afraid, some part of her that was pure and cold and scientific, wanted to see what was inside more than it wanted to be safe. The lock opened. It should not have. 100,000 cycles in vacuum should have welded the mechanism solid, drained any power cell to nothing, corroded any actuator to dust. But when the drone's manipulator arm found the recessed control, a simple mechanical lever, blessedly analog, the kind of thing a species that had been shot at learned to trust more than anything electronic, and pulled it, the outer hatch of the airlock cycled open, smoothly, without protest, as though it had been oiled that morning. There was no puff of escaping atmosphere. The lock was already in vacuum. It had been opened to space on the inner side for a long time then. But the hatch moved, and the mechanism worked, and somewhere deep in the dead cold ship 100,000 cycles old, a machine did exactly what it had been built to do, the first time it had been asked in longer than Veyl Oru's species had been sapient. "It works," she whispered. "The lock works. Everything on the ship still works. It's not dead. It was never dead. It's just been waiting." They sent the drone in. The airlock gave onto a corridor, and the corridor was where the last of Veyl Oru's professional distance failed her, because the corridor was full of the dead. Not bodies. The bodies were long gone, 100,000 cycles of vacuum and cold having reduced whatever organic matter had once been there to nothing, or near nothing. The drone's sensors found faint traces. A whisper of carbon and calcium ghosted onto the deck plating in the vague suggestion of shapes, but nothing that could be called a body. What remained was worse than bodies. What remained was evidence. The corridor was a battlefield. The walls were scarred with the unmistakable signatures of weapons fire, scorching, penetration, the spalled craters of projectile impacts. Sections of the decking had been torn up and repurposed as barricades, dragged into place and welded down in a hurry by hands that had known they were running out of time. There were tools scattered along the deck, and the drone's careful lights showed that some of them were not tools at all, or had not started as tools. A cutting torch modified into a weapon, a hull repair rivet gun with its safety interlocks torn away, a length of structural spar sharpened at one end. Improvised. Desperate. The armaments of people who had run out of real weapons and refused all the same to stop fighting. "They fought in here," Nith said. The linguist had not left the bridge in 2 days. None of them had slept properly. Something got aboard or something turned, and they fought it in these corridors hand to hand with whatever they could pick up. Look at the barricades. Look at how they're placed. They were falling back, position by position, deeper into the ship. They fought for every span of it. "And lost," said the captain. Nith was quiet for a moment, studying the feed. "I don't know," they said finally. "That's the strange part. If they'd lost, if whatever they were fighting had won, you'd expect it to be here. Whatever killed them. And it isn't. The ship is empty. It's empty and it's cold and it's silent and it's still running, and there's a war frozen into every corridor, and there's no enemy anywhere in it. Both sides are gone. It's as though they fought until there was nobody left to fight on either side, and then the ship just kept going, kept holding formation, kept the lights that mattered on, for 100,000 cycles." Veyl Oru flew the drone deeper. She should have handed it off. Her watch had ended twice over. Her limbs ached with the specific exhaustion of holding fine control too long. The relief officer stood at her shoulder, practically begging to take the station. But she would not let go of it. This was hers. She had found it. She had read it right when the captain wanted it to be a wreck. And now she was going to follow it all the way down into the dark heart of the thing, and she was going to be the one who understood. The corridor branched and branched again, and the deeper it went the more the character of the ship changed. The forward sections had been a battlefield. The deeper sections were something else. The deeper sections were a home. Because people had lived here. That much survived. The drone's lights found the small evidences of long habitation, sleeping alcoves cut into the walls, personal in a way that made Veyl Oru's throat tighten, storage lockers, a wide low chamber that could only have been a place of gathering, with the residue of what might have been growing things arranged along one wall in the frozen ghost of a garden. Someone had tried to grow living things in the dark. Someone had wanted, in the middle of a war that had scarred every corridor, to keep something green and alive. And on the walls, everywhere, the markings. They were denser here than on the hull, packed into every flat surface, cut and scratched, and in some places, the drone's chemical sensors suggested, painted in substances Veyl Oru did not want to think too hard about. Rows and rows of them. And interspersed with the blocky glyphs, the pictographs, hundreds of them now, a whole visual language, and Nith made a sound when the drone's lights first swept across them. A small broken sound, and pressed both hands flat against the display. "Their names," the linguist said. "Oru, Oru, those are names. Look, the same glyph cluster repeated, each one different, each one with a mark beside it, a little mark, always the same, a single stroke. I've seen this on 100 dead worlds. I know what this is. This is a memorial wall. Every cluster is a name, and every stroke beside a name is Nith's voice cracked. It's a death. They wrote the names of their dead on the walls and put a mark beside each one, and there are Oru, there are thousands of them. This whole chamber, every surface. Thousands of names and thousands of strokes, and they kept writing them, all the way to the end. They kept a record of every single one of their dead by hand in the dark, while they died, and they never stopped writing them down. Nith did not sleep at all after that. The linguist took the corpus, the vast dense mass of glyphs the drone had recorded, thousands of characters across the hall and the corridors and the memorial chamber, and disappeared into the small analysis bay off the bridge, and for a day and a night did not emerge. And when Veyl Oru brought them a ration and knocked at the hatch, she found Nith surrounded by floating projections, the glyphs spinning and pairing and dissolving in the air around them. And their 4 eyes wild with a light she recognized, because she had felt it herself, out on the scan board on the first day, when the flat line had refused to be a wreck. It's not one language, Nith said without looking up. That's what slowed me. It's 3, or one language across 3 ages of the same people, changing as it goes. The oldest layer on the hull, on the deepest structural members, it's simple, blocky, functional. The kind of writing you make when writing is new. Then a middle layer, more complex, more abstract, the language of a people who'd had writing for a long time and gotten comfortable with it. And then the newest layer, the memorial wall, the last things they wrote. Nith stopped. The newest layer is simple again, simple like the oldest, as though at the end they went back to plain words. As though when they knew they were dying, they didn't want to be clever anymore. They just wanted to be understood. Can you read it? Veyl Oru asked, the same question she had asked at the hull days and a lifetime ago. Nith looked up at her, and their face was wet. Some of it, they said. Enough. I've been working from the pictographs. They're consistent across all 3 layers. They're the Rosetta, the bridge. And I have the whole structure of the memorial wall as a key because I know what it is. I know its names and deaths, so I can anchor the grammar. Oru. The linguist reached out and gripped her forearm with a strength she had not known they possessed. I've read the last entry, the last thing written on the memorial wall, the final name and the words under it. Do you want to hear it? I don't. I've been sitting in here for a day not able to decide if I should tell anyone, because once I say it out loud it's real and I can't take it back. But I have to tell someone. Do you want to hear the last thing these people wrote? Veyl Oru's mouth had gone dry. She thought of the flat line, and the drive that was colder than space, and the thing in the ship that was still, after all this time, quietly running. Yes, she said, tell me. Nith closed their eyes and recited it from memory, in the flat plain cadence of a translation stripped of all ornament, and the words fell into the small bright room like stones into a still pool. This is the last of us. My name is. Nith made a sound, a phonetic approximation, a cluster of consonants no consortium throat was built to shape. And I am the last one who can still hold the tool. The others are on the wall. All of them are on the wall. I have written them all, and now there is only me to write, and no one left to write me, so I write myself here at the end. We came from a blue world 9 turnings around a yellow star, and we called ourselves. Again the impossible cluster of sounds. And this was our ship, and her name was a softer sound, almost gentle, which in our oldest tongue means the one who does not stop. We were not the strongest thing in the dark. We learned that early. We were not the fastest or the cleverest or the eldest. The dark was full of things older and colder than us, and many of them wanted us dead, and some of them very nearly succeeded, and this ship is the record of how nearly. But we had one thing. I will write it here so that whatever finds us knows what we were, because I do not think anyone will remember us otherwise, and I cannot bear for us to be forgotten. We did not stop. That was the whole of it. That was our only strength, and it was enough. When we were beaten, we did not stop. When we were broken, we did not stop. When there were 9 of us left against a thing that had killed 1,000, we did not stop, and the thing died first, because it did not understand that we would rather die on our feet than live any other way, and so it kept expecting us to break, and we kept not breaking until it was gone and we were still here. And now there is one of me, and I will not stop either. I have set the ship to hold her heading. I have set the last of her heart to keep the cold lights burning, the ones that matter, the memorial and the seed vault and the beacon, for as long as the dark allows, which the engineers told me before they died was a very long time. Longer than our sun. She will drift, and she will keep our names, and she will keep our seeds, and she will keep saying, quietly, to anyone who will listen, on a frequency I have set below the noise where only the patient will find it. We were here, we did not stop. If you can hear this, neither should you. I am cold now. I am going to go and lie down among the seeds where it is warmest, and I am going to stop being the one who does not stop, because there is no one left to be it for. But the ship will not stop. I have seen to that. She is the one who does not stop, and she never will, not while there is one warm light left in her, and I hope, that will be a very long time. Whoever you are, whatever found us, do not be afraid of what we were. Be afraid of what we would have become if the dark had led us, and then go and become it yourself. That is the only monument we want. Nith stopped. The analysis bay was very quiet. Around them the glyphs turned slowly in the air, patient and cold, and Veyl Oru realized that she had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of it and had to make herself start again. A beacon, she said finally. Her voice did not sound like her own. The last one said they set a beacon, below the noise, on a frequency where only the patient would find it. Nith's eyes came open. Yes, they said, that's what it says. Why? Because that's it. Veyl Oru was already moving, already turning back toward the bridge, toward her station, toward the flat line she had stared at for 4 days and never once been able to explain. That's the flat line, Nith. That's why it reads as nothing. It's not silent. It was never silent. It's been transmitting this whole time on a band so far below the background, so quiet, so patient, that the instruments read it as part of the noise floor, as part of the empty. They built a beacon designed to look like silence, so that only a survey ship that stopped and looked and refused to accept that empty was empty, only a ship exactly like ours, crewed by someone exactly stubborn enough, would ever find it. She reached the hatch and stopped and looked back, and something had happened to her face that she could not have described. It's not hiding from us. It's testing us. The whole thing is a test, to see if whoever found it was patient enough and stubborn enough to deserve to hear what it has to say. She found the beacon in 4 hours. She had to rebuild half her signal processing chain to do it, tearing down assumptions she had held for 11 cycles, teaching her instruments to look below the floor they had been designed to treat as the bottom of the world. And there it was, exactly where the last of the ship's crew had said it would be. A signal, coherent, structured, cripplingly faint, threaded so cunningly into the background hiss that no ordinary scan would ever separate it out. It had been broadcasting continuously, without pause for 100,000 cycles, out into a dark that had never once answered. Nith, she said, it's not just the memorial, there's structure, there's data. It's not repeating the same message, it's cycling, there's an archive in here, it's huge. Can you? Give it to me, said Nith. Veyl Oru went back to the memorial wall after that in the drone, though there was no operational reason to. The captain let her. Perhaps he understood. She walked the little machine slowly along the chamber, its lights sliding across row upon row of carved names, and she made herself look at every one of them, though she could not read a single glyph, because it seemed to her the least she could do, to be, for a few hours, the eyes that finally looked at what a dying people had spent their last strength writing down. Nith walked her through it over the comm, translating as she went, and it was the worst and best watch of her life. That cluster there, the tall one near the deck, That's an old form. One of the first names on the wall, one of the first to die. The grammar's archaic. The stroke beside it is deep and steady. Whoever cut it had time and a steady hand and probably grief they could still afford. Early in the war, then, when they still had the luxury of mourning properly. Nith's voice was very quiet. Move up. The middle rows, see how the cuts get shallower, faster, cruder. They're running out of time or tools or the strength to cut deep, but they never stop. Look, they never once stop. There's not a name without its stroke. However bad it got, someone always finished the entry. That was the discipline. That was the thing they would not let go of. You could lose the war, you could lose the world, but you would not lose the name. Every single one of them got written down. How many? Veyl Oru asked, though she did not want to know. I've counted the memorial chamber, just this one room. Nith paused. 14,000 and change. And there are marks on the wall indicating this is the third such chamber. The other two are deeper in the ship, sealed, and I don't think we should open them. Call it 40,000 names across the three. 40,000 dead on one ship over the course of a war long enough to fill 3 chambers floor to ceiling with the careful record of the dying. And this was the last ship, Oru, the survivor, the lucky one. Imagine the others. Veyl Oru could not imagine the others. She walked the drone in silence for a while, and then she stopped it before a section of the wall that was different from the rest, not names, but a long, unbroken passage of the blocky glyphs, cut deep and careful, taking up a whole span of bulkhead. What's this one? She said. It's not names. It's too long. Nith was quiet for a moment, while the drone's lights held steady on the passage. That's a song, they said finally, and their voice did something strange. Or the structure is a song or a chant, something with meter, something meant to be spoken aloud together. It repeats. There's a refrain. I can give you the shape of it if not the sound. And Nith read it haltingly, feeling for the meaning under the meter, and it came out in the translation stripped and plain, the way the maker's last words always did. When the cold comes and the lights go out, we do not stop. When the ship is broken and the air runs thin, we do not stop. When the ones we love are on the wall and there is no one left to sing this but ourselves, we do not stop. We are the ones who do not stop. We will be here when the dark forgets why it was ever afraid. And it will remember, and it will be afraid again. Because we did not stop. The drone's lights held on the carved words. Somewhere behind Veyl Oru, on the bridge, she heard someone make a small sound. They sang that, she said. In here, in the cold and the dark, dying with the enemy in the corridors, they stopped and cut a song into the wall so that whoever came next would know they sang. She found she could not quite steady her own voice. Nith, what kind of people do that? What kind of people at the very end use their last strength to make sure the thing that outlives them is a song? The kind that win, Nith said, even when they lose. I've reconstructed 40 dead languages, Oru. I've read the last words of 40 extinct peoples, and they all, almost all, end the same way, in fear, in pleading, in the small desperate arithmetic of a people trying to bargain with an ending. Do you know how many of them left songs? The linguist's voice cracked. None, not one. In my whole career until now, not one dead people ever spent its final hour making something beautiful for a stranger it would never meet. They made walls and weapons and locked doors. They tried to survive. These people knew they couldn't survive, and they made a song instead, and they aimed at 100,000 cycles into the future at someone exactly like us, and they were right. We came. We heard it. And now I'm never going to be able to unhear it, and I don't want to, and I think that's the point. I think that was always the point. They didn't want to be survived. They wanted to be sung. Veyl Oru sat at her station in the dim of the bridge, with the drone's lights holding on a song carved into the hull of a dead ship by people who had refused, in the teeth of extinction, to be anything less than magnificent. And she understood for the first time, all the way down, that she was not afraid of them. She was in love with them. The whole crew was. It had crept up on all of them over 6 days, disguised as horror, and the horror had been real. But underneath the horror this other thing had grown, and it was the thing the makers had wanted, and it was the reason the beacon had been built the way it had, not to frighten but to find. To find the ones who, when they finally understood what they were looking at, would feel not terror but recognition, would feel the thing rise up in them that Quenth had named in the mess compartment, the thing that would rather die knowing than live wondering, the thing that could not look and would know it for what it was, because it was the same thing that had cut these names, and sung this song, and built a machine to make a hole in the universe rather than go quietly into the dark. "Bring the drone home," said Doral Sath very gently, and Veyl Oru realized her hands had gone still on the controls. "That's enough for now, Oru. Bring it home." She brought it home. But she did not stop thinking about the song, and when the trap sprang, 3 days later, and the cold heart of the ship woke and began its climb toward the unmaking of the sky, it was the song she thought of first, and it was the song that told her, before Nith found the physics or she found the test, that the makers would never, ever have built a thing that killed the very people it was singing to. There had to be a way through. People who sang did not lay traps without doors. She just had to be worthy of the door. The archive took the linguist 3 days to open, and when it opened it nearly broke them. It was not one message, it was everything. It was a civilization's entire memory of itself, compressed and encoded and set to broadcast on a whisper into the dark, on the theory, the desperate, defiant, impossibly hopeful theory, that being forgotten was worse than dying, and that if you could not survive, you could at least refuse to vanish. The last crew of the ship had done the only thing left to a dying people. They had written down what they were, all of it, and thrown it into the silence, and trusted that somewhere, sometime, something patient enough to hear it would come. And something had. Veyl Oru could not stop thinking about that. For 100,000 cycles the beacon had spoken to no one, into a dark that gave back nothing, a message in a bottle cast into an ocean with no shore. And by the sheerest chance, by the accident of a survey cutter's route, and one scan officer's refusal to log a wreck, it had finally, after all that time, found an ear. She felt the weight of that. She felt that the whole crew felt it. They had stopped pretending this was a survey and started understanding it as something closer to a witnessing. Nith gave them the archive in pieces, as they cracked it, in the small hours when no one could sleep, and the pieces assembled into a history. They had come from a single world, the makers of the ship. A small world, wet and warm, orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable corner of the arm. They had risen late, later than the consortium, later than the meridians, later than any of the galaxy's established peoples. And they had risen into a galaxy that was, Veyl Oru understood with a slow, cold horror, nothing like the one she thought she lived in. Because the archive remembered the others. There were more of them, Nith said on the second night, their voice hollow. More species. The dark used to be full. The archive is full of them, dozens, hundreds. The makers cataloged everyone they met the way we catalog everyone we meet. Only the makers met them 100,000 cycles ago, and Oru I've been cross-referencing, against our own records, against the consortium's own history of the galaxy. Nith stopped. Most of them are gone, the species in this archive. The great old civilizations the makers met when they first went into the dark. We don't have any record of them. Not a trace. They existed, this archive proves they existed. They were mighty, they were ancient, they were everything the makers were not, and sometime in the 100,000 cycles since, every single one of them died, and left so little behind that a whole galaxy's worth of survey services never even knew they were there. Died how? The captain asked. He had come to the analysis bay now too. They all had. The bridge ran on skeleton watch while the crew of the Thren's Mercy gathered to hear the dead speak. The archive has a theory, Nith said. The makers had a theory. They called it, the linguist gave the sound, soft and terrible. The closest translation is the winnowing, or the cull. They believed, and they had evidence, Oru, they weren't guessing. This is a scientific document, they showed their work. They believed that the galaxy was old, and that in its age it had grown quiet, and that the quiet was not natural. That something moved through the dark slowly, patiently, on a timescale of tens of thousands of cycles, and found the civilizations that had grown loud and bright and confident and put them out. Not all at once, not in a war anyone could see, just a pressure. A patient, ancient, methodical pressure that had been culling the galaxy of its bright things for longer than any of the bright things had existed, and that had, one by one, over the deeps of time, silenced almost everyone. Veyl Oru thought of the flat line. She thought of the great engineered quiet that lay over this whole arm of the galaxy, the silence she had spent her whole career describing and never once thought to question. She had assumed the dark was empty because dark was what space was. She had never asked why. "And the makers," she said slowly, "the makers of this ship, what happened to them?" "They fought it," Nith said. The bay went silent. "They found it, the thing in the dark, the pressure, whatever it was, and unlike everyone before them, they did not go quiet. They did not accept it. The archive is very clear on this, and it says it, I think, with what for them was pride. Every other species that met the winnowing did the sensible thing. They hid. They went quiet. They pulled in their signals and dimmed their stars and tried to be too small to notice, and it found them anyway in the end because it was patient and it was old and it had all the time there was. But the makers," Nith laughed, a wet broken sound. "The makers were young and stupid and stubborn, and they had only just come out into the dark, and they did not know that you were supposed to be afraid. So when the winnowing came for them, they did the thing no one had ever done. They went toward it. They built ships, this ship and others, a fleet of them, and they armed them with everything they had, iron and fire and their own furious refusal, and they went out into the dark to find the thing that had been quietly murdering the galaxy since before their son was born, and they made it stop being quiet. They made it fight. For the first time in the memory of the archive, the winnowing met something that would not be winnowed, and it had to fight for a kill, and the fighting cost it." "Did they win?" Veyl Oru whispered. Nith looked at her with their wet, wild eyes. "They lost," the linguist said. "Of course they lost. Look around you. This is the last ship of a dead species. They lost, Oru. They were young and small and outnumbered and outmatched, and outaged by a thing that had been killing gods for 100 million cycles. And they lost. And they died, all of them. This ship and every ship in their fleet and their blue wet world 9 turnings around a yellow star. All of it gone." The linguist leaned forward, and their voice dropped, and every soul in that small, bright room leaned forward with them to hear it. "But it cost the winnowing everything to kill them. That's what the archive is really about. That's the message under the message. They made it bleed. A thing that had unmade the mightiest civilizations in the galaxy without ever taking a wound. They hurt it. They hurt it so badly that when the last of their fleet was gone, the winnowing withdrew. It stopped. The archive's final observations, the last data the makers gathered before they died, show it going dark, going still, going somewhere to lick wounds that nothing in 100 million cycles had ever given it. It has not moved since. As far as the makers could tell, in their dying, they broke it. A species that lasted 11,000 cycles from fire to starflight, that never rose above a single wet world in one ragged fleet, reached up and broke the oldest predator in the galaxy across its knee, and died doing it. And the reason the dark is quiet now, the reason nothing has been culled in 100,000 cycles, the reason the Consortium and the Meridians and the Scytha and every other young bright species got to rise up safe and confident and ignorant into an empty, peaceful galaxy." Nith's voice broke completely. "Is that 100,000 cycles ago, a species you have never heard of from a world you will never find, went out into the dark and died killing the thing that would have killed us all. We are alive because they refused to stop, every one of us. The whole bright young galaxy. We are the monument. We are the thing they wanted us to become, and we never even knew their name." There was one more thing in the open archive, before the sealed vault, and it was the thing that made the crew of the Thren's Mercy stop grieving the makers, and start being afraid for themselves. Nith found it on the third night, buried in the scientific records, in the section the makers had used to catalog the other peoples of the dark, the great old civilizations they had met when they first went out, the ones that were all gone now. Most of the catalog was observation. This species looked so, lived so, believed so. But one entry was different. One entry was a warning the makers had written to themselves, and then, apparently, decided to leave for whoever came after, because it was the truest and hardest thing they had learned. It's about how the winnowing hunts, Nith said. The linguist's hands had stopped shaking. They had passed some threshold of exhaustion into an eerie calm. Not the physics of it, the strategy. The makers studied it for their whole war, and they wrote down what they learned, and Oru, it's not what you'd think. The winnowing doesn't come in with fleets. It doesn't burn worlds from orbit. That's not how it killed the old civilizations, and it's not why nobody remembers them. It's much worse than that, and much quieter. How then? Said the captain. It teaches them to be afraid, Nith said. That's the whole method. It arrives at the edge of a civilization, a bright, confident young people, out among the stars, sure of themselves, and it doesn't attack. It watches, it probes. It takes one ship here, one colony there, quietly at the edges, and it lets the survivors run home with the story. And the story spreads and the civilization pulls in. It stops sending ships into the deep dark. It dims its stars so it won't be seen. It goes quiet and careful and small, and it tells itself it's being wise. And the winnowing waits and picks off the edges, a little at a time, patient as erosion, and the civilization contracts and contracts, growing more careful, more frightened, more quiet, until one day it has made itself so small and so still and so afraid that it has, without ever being conquered, simply stopped. Stopped exploring. Stopped growing. Stopped being the thing it was. And then the winnowing walks in and finishes what's left, and there's almost nothing to finish because the civilization did most of the work itself. It frightened itself to death. That's the winnowing's real weapon, not its ships. Fear. It makes the bright things afraid of the dark, and the fear does the rest. The bridge was silent. Veyl Oru thought about the survey service, which crept toward every unknown thing a span at a time. She thought about the whole careful, cautious galaxy, its trade lanes safe and mapped, its peoples content to stay in the warm, well-charted places and leave the deep dark to the cutters. She thought about how normal it all was, how sensible, how wise, how much it looked like a civilization that had, at some point long ago, been taught to be afraid. That's why the makers won, she said slowly. Isn't it? That's the whole thing. The winnowing's weapon is fear, and the makers were the one species that didn't have the fear. They came out into the dark before anyone had time to teach them to be afraid of it. So when the winnowing tried its method, took a ship here, a colony there, let the survivors run home with the story, the makers didn't pull in. They did the opposite. The story spread, and instead of dimming their stars, they lit more of them. Instead of going quiet, they got louder. Instead of running home, they built a fleet and went out to find the thing. The winnowing's entire strategy was built on the certainty that fear works, that it always works, that it has always worked on everything. And it met one species that hadn't learned to be afraid, and its whole method broke against them, because you cannot frighten a people to death if they refuse, on principle, to be frightened. And that, said Nith very quietly, is what the makers were afraid we'd have lost. Read the vault entry, the one right before the sealed part. They wrote it about us, not us specifically, whoever came after. They knew they were dying, and they knew the winnowing would heal and come back, and they knew it would come back for a galaxy full of young species who'd risen up in the peace the makers bought, and they were afraid, more than they were afraid of dying, that those young species would have grown up careful, comfortable, wise, afraid of the dark without ever knowing why. They were afraid we'd be exactly the kind of prey the winnowing was built to cull. And so they built the beacon and the test and this whole terrible patient trap, not just to hurt the enemy one more time, but to find out whether whoever came had kept the one thing that mattered. Whether the bright young galaxy, safe and ignorant, still had it in them to come close, to risk themselves, to refuse to be afraid. "And if we didn't," said Doral Sath. Nith looked at the captain, and their face was grave. "Then the ship would have killed us," they said simply. "That's the other half of the trap. It's not only a lure for the enemy, it's a test for the friend. If whatever came was careful, if it crept in and stayed at range and sent probes and never risked itself, like the winnowing, like a frightened people that had already been half-culled, then it had already lost, already become prey, already stopped being the thing the makers died to protect. And the makers, I think, would rather have unmade it, and themselves and the whole discovery, than let it carry the archive home and turn their song into a museum piece for a species too frightened to deserve it. It's brutal. It's the most demanding thing I've ever read. But I understand it. They spent everything they were on one bet, that not stopping matters more than surviving, and they were not going to hand the proof of it to anyone who hadn't made the same bet with their own life." The linguist's voice dropped. "So when this ship wakes up, and it will wake up, the moment we've understood enough to be worth testing, it's not going to ask whether we're the enemy. It already half knows we're not. It's going to ask whether we're worth saving. And there's only one way to answer a question like that. Not with words, not from a safe distance. You have to show it. You have to come close." Veyl Oru sat with that in the dim of the bridge, and she was not surprised. She found she was not surprised at all, when 3 days later the flat line spiked, and the cold heart of the ship began to wake, and the test she had been quietly dreading and quietly longing for since the first hour finally, at last, began. She had known, on some level, since the moment she refused to log a wreck, that the ship was not a wreck, that it was watching. That it would, eventually, ask her the only question that had ever really mattered, the question the makers had built their whole magnificent doomed civilization around, the question they had died answering and carved into iron, so that no one who came after could pretend they had not been asked. "When the cold comes and the lights go out, will you stop?" And Veyl Oru, senior scan officer of the survey cutter Thren's Mercy, who had spent 11 cycles cataloging dead things in the dark and had just, at last, found something worth being alive for, already knew her answer, and had known it, she thought, her whole life, without ever before being given anything large enough to say it to. No, she would say, with her own hand flat against the hull, down the barrel of the biggest weapon in the galaxy, on behalf of every bright young thing that ever refused to believe the dark was empty. "No, we will not stop. They should have left then." Veyl Oru knew it afterward with the perfect clarity of hindsight, that the right thing, the sane thing, the thing a wiser crew would have done, was to take the archive and the memorial and the last words of a dead species, and turn the cutter around, and carry the greatest discovery in the history of the survey service home to a galaxy that owed its entire existence to the people who had made it. They had what they came for. They had more than anyone had ever dreamed of finding. But the beacon was still cycling, and Nith was still reading, and on the 4th night the linguist found the part of the archive that the makers had encrypted deeper than all the rest, behind the memorial and the history and the seed catalog, in the innermost vault of the message. And they came onto the bridge with a face the color of ash, and said the words that Veyl Oru would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. "It's not dead," Nith said. "The winnowing, it's not dead. The makers didn't kill it. They never claimed they killed it. I mistranslated. I wanted it to be dead, so I read it as dead, and that's my failure, and I'm sorry. They didn't kill it. They wounded it, and they drove it off, and then they did something else. They did the thing that this whole ship is actually for. Everything else, the memorial, the archive, the seeds, that's all secondary. That's the message. But the ship itself, the reason it's still running, the reason there's a heart in it colder than space that never stopped." The flat line spiked. It happened at that exact moment, and Veyl Oru would never be certain to the end of her days whether it was coincidence or whether the ship had somehow been waiting for someone to understand, for the message to be read, for the test to be passed or failed. But as Nith spoke the words, the reason it's still running, her scan board, which had held a perfect flat line for 6 days, jumped. Heat, a bloom of it, deep in the aft third of the ship, in the exact place where the drive was colder than the dark. The cold place was warming. Something was waking up. "Captain," Veyl Oru said, and her voice was very steady, the way it went when she was most afraid, "the object is generating heat, localized aft at the drive. It's the outer lattice, the part I couldn't identify, the newest part. It's powering up. Whatever that thing is, it's coming online, and it's coming online now." "Get the drone out," Doral Sath said instantly. "Break the clamps, back us off full." "It's not a weapon," Nith said. "Captain, wait, listen to me. It's not a weapon, it's not waking up to attack us, that's not what the ship is for. The vault, the innermost message. The ship is a trap. It's a trap they set 100,000 cycles ago, and it's not for us." "Explain fast." Nith spoke very fast. "The makers wounded the winnowing and drove it off, and they knew it would come back. They knew a thing that old and that patient would wait and heal and come back and finish what it started. Not for them, they were already finished, but for everyone after. For the next bright young species and the next, all the ones that would rise up in the peace the makers had bought them. The winnowing would come back for us, and the makers couldn't stop that. They were dying. They had one ship left. So they did the only thing they could. They turned themselves into bait." The heat bloom on Veyl Oru's board was growing. The cold heart of the ship was coming alive, and as it woke, her instruments began at last to understand what the outer lattice was, and the understanding crawled up her spine like ice. "They set the beacon," Nith said, "on a frequency below the noise, patient, quiet, exactly the kind of signal the winnowing hunts for, the last whisper of a not-quite-dead civilization. A lure. A wounded thing crying softly in the dark on purpose for 100,000 cycles, saying, 'Here I am, come and finish me.' And they wired this ship, this last ship, into a single-use engine of a kind nothing in the galaxy has ever built. The outer lattice. Oru, tell them what the lattice is." "You've resolved it by now. Tell them what it does." Veyl Oru's mouth was dry. The numbers were on her board, and they were insane, and they were real. "It's a bomb," she said. "It's the biggest bomb I've ever conceived of. The lattice isn't a drive. I read it as a drive because it's shaped like one, because it's built around the drive core, but it's not for moving the ship. It's for unmaking a region of space. I don't have the physics. We don't have the physics, but it's a controlled collapse, a folding. It takes the field drive geometry and inverts it. And instead of pushing the ship through space, it pulls space through the ship. And everything in a radius of," she checked the number, checked it again, "could not make it smaller, of several light seconds, just stops existing. It's a hole. They built a machine that makes a hole in the universe. And then they sat here in the dark, crying softly on a lure frequency, for 100,000 cycles, waiting for the one thing in the galaxy patient enough to hunt a dying signal to finally come close enough. And we came instead," said Doral Sath. The bridge went silent. "We came instead," Veyl Oru repeated very quietly. "We're the patient thing that hunts dying signals. We're a survey ship. That's oh no, that's what a survey ship is. We do exactly what the winnowing does. We find the quiet places and we go and look. The lure wasn't only for the winnowing. Anything patient enough would answer it. And we answered it. And the ship." The heat bloom flared, and her whole board lit, and every alarm the Thren's mercy carried began to scream at once. "The ship thinks we're it," she finished. "The ship has been sitting here for 100,000 cycles waiting for a predator patient enough to hunt a dying whisper, and we walked our drone into its airlock and read its whole archive and matched velocities at 100 spans, and by every measure it was built to recognize. We are the thing it's waiting for. It's arming. Nith, is there any way to tell it, any signal, any code, is there a way to say we're not?" "I'm looking," Nith said, already deep in the archive, hands flying. "There has to be the makers wouldn't have, they'd have thought of this, they thought of everything. They had 100,000 cycles to think. There has to be a recognition protocol, a way to abort. "Captain," said Quint from the helm in a voice gone thin and high, "I can't break the clamps. Our drone. When the lattice came online, it locked the airlock mechanism, and the drone's clamps are magnetic, and the hull it went ferromagnetic, all of it. The whole hull is a magnet now. It's holding the drone, and the drone's tether is..." The first officer's hand scrabbled at the controls. "It's holding us. The tether. We're anchored to it. I can't get us loose. And even if I cut the tether, we're inside the collapse radius, sir. We've been inside it for 4 days. We let it pull us in 100 spans at a time, and we never..." "How long?" Doral Sath said. Veyl Oru looked at the heat curve. She had spent 11 cycles reading the language of things warming and cooling in the dark. She had never in her life read a curve she wanted less to understand. "By the power ramp," she said, "the lattice reaches full charge in a little under 1 hour, and then it fires. And then there is a hole in the universe several light seconds across, and we are in the middle of it, and so is the ship, and so is the archive, and so is every name on every wall, and so is the last of a people who spent 100,000 cycles waiting to take one more piece of the thing that killed them down with them." She turned from her board. "And it's going to be us. It's been waiting all this time to die killing its enemy, and the first thing that ever came close enough was us, and we are going to be the thing it dies killing, and we don't even deserve it. We came to say hello." The next 50 minutes were the longest of Veyl Oru's life, and she spent them doing the only thing she had ever been good at, which was reading a machine that did not want to be understood. Doral Sath did everything a captain could do, and none of it worked. He ordered the tether cut. The cutting charge fired, and the tether parted, and it did not matter, because the drone was welded to a hull that had turned itself into a magnet, and the whole cutter was drifting inside a collapse radius they had spent 4 days easing themselves into. He ordered full reverse. The drive strained, and the ship crept back a few spans, and Veyl Oru watched the numbers and told him the truth, which was that at that acceleration they would clear the collapse radius in 9 hours, and the lattice would fire in 50 minutes, and there was no version of the arithmetic that let them run. So they stopped trying to run. And in the strange calm that comes to people when running is no longer an option, they went to work on the only door left, which was the ship itself. "There's a protocol," Nith said. They had not moved from the archive in an hour. Their eyes were bloodshot and their hands shook, and they spoke in the clipped, exhausted cadence of someone holding themselves together by force of will. "There has to be. The makers weren't fools. They knew the lure might catch the wrong thing. They knew another young species might rise up and come looking, exactly the way we did, a survey ship, curious, patient, unarmed. They wouldn't have built a trap that killed the very people they died to protect. That would make the whole thing meaningless. There's a way to tell it we're friendly. I know there is. I just have to find it before." 40 minutes, said Veyl Oru. She was not helping Nith with the language. She could not read a word of it. She was doing the other thing, the thing that was hers. She was reading the machine. And as the lattice charged, as the cold heart of the ship blazed hotter and hotter on her board, she was learning it, learning its rhythms, its logic, the shape of the intelligence that ran it. Because there was an intelligence. Not a mind, not exactly. The last of the makers had died 100,000 cycles ago. But they had left something behind to run the ship, some patient, automated warden. And it was watching the Thren's mercy the way she was watching it. And it was asking a question. And she thought, she had begun to think that she could tell what the question was. "It's not just arming," she said suddenly. "Nith, Captain, it's not simply counting down to fire. Look at the power curve, it's not smooth, it's sampling. Every few seconds it pulses, a little probe, active sensor, it's scanning us. It's been scanning us since the moment it woke. It's not sure. It's charging the weapon, yes, but it's still deciding, it's still asking a question about us, and if I can figure out what the question is." "It's asking if we're the enemy," Nith said. "Yes, but how does it know?" "How would it know? It's never seen the winnowing up close. The makers fought it at range. In the archive it's always at a distance. They never got a good look. So the warden doesn't have a picture of the enemy. It can't recognize the winnowing by sight. It has to recognize it by behavior, by what a thing does. Veyl Oru's 4 eyes were flying across the board now, and her voice was rising, and for the first time in 50 minutes something other than dread was in it. Nith, the makers. When they fought the winnowing, how did the winnowing fight? What did it do? In the archive, how did the enemy behave? Nith stared at her, and then dove back into the projections, faster than before. It was patient, they said, reading, methodical. It didn't attack, not at first. It approached, it studied. It took its time, it circled its prey for a long time before it struck, learning, mapping. It Oru, it did exactly what we did. It crept in slowly, it matched velocities, it sent probes ahead of itself. It read everything it could before it committed. That's how the winnowing hunts, carefully, coldly, from a safe distance. It never risks itself. It never commits until it's certain. That's how it killed 100 million cycles of civilizations without ever taking a wound. It was never brave. It was only ever patient. And Veyl Oru understood. It came to her all at once, the way the flat line had come to her on the first day, a piece of the universe clicking into a shape that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. That's the test, she said. That's the whole test. The makers couldn't leave a picture of the enemy because they never had one, so they left a behavioral test instead. The warden watches whatever comes close, and it asks one question: is this thing brave or is it careful? Because the winnowing is careful. The winnowing never risks itself. The winnowing hunts from a safe distance and never once in 100 million cycles put its own body between itself and harm. That's what it is. That's the thing the makers understood about it that let them hurt it. It could not conceive of an enemy that would trade its own life to land a blow, because it had never once been willing to trade its own. And she stopped. We've done exactly what the winnowing does. We crept in. We stayed at range. We sent a drone instead of a body. We read everything from a safe distance. We have behaved from the moment we arrived exactly like the careful, patient, cowardly thing this ship was built to kill. And that's why it's arming, because we passed the wrong test. We proved we were careful. The bridge was silent. Then we fail it, said Doral Sath. Veyl Oru turned to look at her captain, and found him already rising from his chair. And she saw in his old, tired face the thing she had been groping toward and had not yet dared to say. We prove we're not the winnowing, he said. By doing the one thing the winnowing would never do, we stop being careful, we commit. We put a body between ourselves and the harm. He was moving now toward the lift, and his voice had gone into a register Veyl Oru had never heard from him, flat and final and strangely light, the voice of a man who has found, at the very end, a thing worth doing. The drone stays at range. A body doesn't. If that warden is watching for something brave enough to risk itself, then somebody flies over there in the flesh, unarmored, unafraid, and knocks on the door with their own hand. Somebody trades the safe distance for a closed one. Somebody commits. Captain Quinth began. It has to be me, Doral Sath said. I'm the oldest thing on this ship, and I've had the longest life, and I'm the one who gave the order that flew us into this. And command is just the right to go first through the bad door. Oru, prep the shuttle. Nith, find me whatever the makers left as a greeting, a peace sign. The thing you say when you come in the flesh to say we are not your enemy. Find it and burn it into the shuttle's transmitter, and I'll broadcast it the whole way in. I'm going to fly a body over there, slow and open and unafraid, straight down the barrel of the biggest bomb in the galaxy. And I'm going to show that warden that we're the kind of thing that comes close. The kind that risks itself. The kind the makers wanted to find. And Veyl Oru, who had never in 11 cycles disobeyed an order, said, no. She said it quietly, but the whole bridge heard it, and Doral Sath stopped at the lift and turned. Sir, she said, with respect, you have the reasoning exactly backward, and if you fly that shuttle you will kill us all. She stood, and her long neck was straight, and all 4 of her eyes were on her captain. You're thinking like command, first through the bad door, but that's not what the warden is watching for. It's not watching for the oldest. It's not watching for the one whose life is worth the least. That's still an accounting, that's still the winnowing's logic, spending the cheapest piece, risking the least. If we send the old man because his life is nearly done and costs us least, we're being careful about our courage. We're rationing it. And the warden will see that, because it's exactly the kind of carefulness it was built to catch. Then who? Said Doral Sath. The one who has the most to lose, Veyl Oru said. The one whose life is longest ahead of them, the one it costs the most to risk. That's what commitment means. Not spending what you can spare, spending what you can't. She was already moving toward the lift, and her voice did not shake, and she was distantly amazed at that. I'm the youngest senior officer on this ship. I have the most cycles ahead of me of anyone qualified to fly that shuttle. I found this ship. I read the flat line, I found the beacon, I understood the test. It's mine, and I understand the makers now, sir. I've been reading them for 6 days. I know what they were. They were young and small, and they had everything to lose, and they went toward the thing in the dark anyway because they would rather die on their feet than live any other way, and that's the whole reason they won. She reached the lift and turned, and for the first time in 6 days she was not afraid, and she did not know why, and she did not question it. The one who does not stop. That's the name of the ship. Let me go over there and prove to it that we're the same. Let me be the one who does not stop. Doral Sath looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the lift, and it was the hardest thing she ever watched a person do, and he said, "Go make some noise, Oru." She did not know why the words landed the way they did. She would learn, much later, that they were older than she was, older than the survey service, a thing one people said to another when it sent its young out past the wall to speak to the dark, but she did not know that then. She only knew that they were the right words, and she carried them with her into the shuttle. She flew it herself, of course. She would not have trusted anyone else. The shuttle was a survey lander, unarmed, unarmored, a fragile bubble of atmosphere and instruments never meant to do anything braver than drop a scientist onto a quiet moon. She undocked it from the Thren's Mercy and pointed its nose at the vast pitted wall of the impossible ship, and she did not creep. That was the whole point, and she held to it with everything she had. She did not match velocities in 100 careful increments. She did not send a probe ahead. She flew straight in, open and slow and steady, down the barrel of a weapon that could unmake a region of space, broadcasting on every band the thing that Nith had found in the deepest vault of the archive. A signal the makers had left as the countersign, the peace word, the thing you sent when you came in the flesh to say, "I am not the hunter, I am the answer to your waiting." Nith had translated it. It was 3 words. In the makers' oldest, simplest tongue, the tongue they had gone back to at the end when they did not want to be clever anymore, it said, "We came close." That was all. Not "we come in peace," which any coward could say from a safe distance. Not "we mean no harm," which the winnowing itself might have said to lull its prey. Just the one fact the warden was built to check, the one thing the enemy could never truthfully claim, offered as both message and proof by the act of offering it. We came close. We are the kind that comes close. We risked ourselves to say it to your face. On her board, the flat line no longer flat, blazing now, the cold heart of the ship roaring toward full charge, held steady as she approached. And then, at 40 spans, it did something it had not done in 100,000 cycles. It paused. The power curve, which had been climbing in a smooth, remorseless ramp toward detonation, flattened. The warden had stopped charging. It was watching her come. A survey scientist, alone, unarmored, in a fragile bubble, flying straight and slow and unafraid into the mouth of the largest weapon in the galaxy, broadcasting 3 plain words in a dead language, and the ancient patient intelligence that ran the ship, that had waited 100,000 cycles for something brave enough to be worth killing or worth saving, watched her come, and asked its one question, and got, for the first time since the makers died, the answer it had been built to hope for, and had almost stopped believing it would ever hear. At 10 spans, Veyl Oru reached out with one of her 4 hands and touched the hull. Not with a drone, not with a manipulator arm. With her own hand, through the thin skin of the shuttle's forward contact port, palm flat against a plate of iron and impossible lattice that a dying species had carved with the names of all its dead. She did not know why she did it. It was not in any plan. It was the most human thing she would ever do, though she did not have that word, and she pressed her hand against the cold hull of the one who does not stop, and she said, aloud in her own tongue, to a crew that had been dead for 100,000 cycles, "We heard you, we're here, and we won't stop either." The heat bloom died. It happened all at once, on her board and under her hand at the same instant. The cold heart of the ship, which had roared toward the unmaking of a region of space, simply banked its fire and went quiet. The lattice powered down. The magnet released. Deep in the ship, some patient warden, satisfied at last, set down the weapon it had held ready for longer than Veyl Oru's species had existed, and did instead the other thing it had been built to do, the thing it had waited 100,000 cycles to do, on the day something finally came close enough and brave enough to deserve it. It gave her the rest of the archive. Not the beacon's whisper, the thin lure signal below the noise, the full flood. Everything the makers were, everything they knew, everything they had learned in 11,000 cycles of rising from fire to starflight, and everything they had learned in the war that killed them. The location of the winnowing's last known heading, the physics of the lattice, the design of the trap, the map of where the enemy had gone to heal, and how long the makers had estimated it might take, which was long, but not forever. It poured into the shuttle's receivers and through the tight beam into the Thren's Mercy, and Veyl Oru sat with her hand against the hull and wept, because she understood, finally, all of it, the whole shape of the thing. The ship was never a nightmare. The scan had read a nightmare, a thing that lied about being dead, that hid a weapon that could unmake the sky, that woke to kill whatever came near, and every reading had been true, and every reading had been the opposite of the truth. It was not a monster in the dark. It was a sentinel. The last soldier of a dead army, standing its post at the edge of a battlefield 100,000 cycles cold, holding one last shot in reserve for the enemy's return, and refusing, patient, cold, silent, unstoppable, to fire it on anything that had not proven itself worthy of the maker's final gift. The nightmare was real, but the nightmare had never been the maker's. The nightmare was the thing they had died to hold at bay, the thing still out there in the dark, healing, and the ship was not the horror. The ship was the warning that the horror was coming back. The Thren's Mercy carried it home. They did not board the ship in the end. They did not need to, and none of them wanted to disturb the seed vault or the memorial or the quiet chamber where, somewhere, a warm place among the seeds still held the faintest ghost of the last of the makers, who had gone to lie down where it was warmest and stop being the one who does not stop. They took the archive, all of it, and they logged the coordinates, and they broadcast the discovery back to Relay 7 on every band the consortium monitored, in the clear, loud and unashamed and unafraid, because the time for hiding in the dark was over, and Veyl Oru would be damned before she'd whisper. The galaxy did not believe it at first. Then it did. It had to. The physics were in the archive, and the physics were real, and any people patient enough to check them found, threaded through the numbers, the same conclusion the makers had reached in their dying, that the dark was quiet for a reason, that the reason had a shape, and that the shape was healing out past the wall and would one day come again. The makers had bought the young galaxy 100,000 cycles. Nearly all of it was spent. And so the bright young species, the consortium and the meridians and the Scytha and all the others, all the ones who had risen up safe and ignorant into a peace they never knew had been paid for, did the thing the last of the makers had asked, in the final plain words carved into the memorial wall, the words Nith read aloud one last time to the assembled captains of the survey service when the Thren's Mercy came home. Do not be afraid of what we were. Be afraid of what we would have become if the dark had let us, and then go and become it yourself. That is the only monument we want. They built ships, not survey cutters thin and toothless. They built the other kind, the kind the makers had built, iron and fire and refusal, armored against attack from ahead and below because they had learned, from a wall of 10,000 names, what came for the bright things in the dark. They built a fleet and they built it fast, and at the front of it, because she had asked, and because no one could think of a reason to refuse her, they put the survey officer who had read a flat line and refused to call it a wreck. Veyl Oru stood on the bridge of the first of them, on the day it launched, and looked out at the black going up and up without end, salted with stars, and thought about a species she had never met, from a blue world 9 turnings around a yellow star, who had gone out into that dark young and small and afraid and gone anyway, who had rather died on their feet than lived any other way, who had looked at the oldest, coldest, most patient predator in the galaxy and had not in the end been afraid of it, because they had understood all the way down the one thing it never could, that the point was never to survive. The point was to not stop. She put her hand on the throttle gate, not to move it, just to feel it. And then she flew her fleet toward the wall, and past it, out into the long dark where the horror was healing, to be the monument the makers had asked for, and to finish, at last, on behalf of every bright young thing that ever looked up at the stars and refused to believe the dark was empty. The war that a dead people had begun 100,000 cycles ago and never, not for one single instant, agreed to lose. They had thought it was just another ship. The scan had proved it was a nightmare. And the nightmare, it turned out, had been the best thing that ever happened to them, because it had come with a set of instructions, carved by hand into iron by the bravest people who had ever lived, and the instructions said, in the plainest words a dying species could find. We did not stop. If you can hear this, neither should you. They could hear it. They did not stop.